This afternoon's lecturer is the Reverend Dr. David Frenchak, who is the President Emeritus for SCOOP, which is the Seminary Consortium for Urban Pastoral Education. Dr. Frenchak taught courses at SCOOP on urban ministry, prophetic preaching, and public issues. Prior to his work with SCOOP, Dr. Frenchak was a pastor at Calvary Baptist Church in Dorchester, Massachusetts, and he held that post for 10 years. Since leaving SCOOP, he has taught courses in public theology at Luther Seminary, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, and Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, which is my alma mater. Dr. Frenchak is a colleague, a friend, and a mentor to me. Dr. Frenchak, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Good afternoon. It's good to be with you, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to share with you some of my dreams and schemes about public theology. Now, I won't claim to have all the answers this afternoon to all the questions about what public theology is, but I do hope to give you at least some concepts and some structure for thinking about what it is we are talking about when we're talking about public theology. And I'm going to talk about it from my theological perspective, which is Christian. However, I'm very aware and have worked with interfaith dynamics around public theology, so that it's a good platform for bringing interfaith folk together when they're thinking about how you think about God in the public sphere and the public arena. Now, my assumption is that we're all gathered here because we are all students of theology. Some of us have been at it a little longer than others. And if we were to do a search of theology, which some of you may have done, you would discover that there's a great variety of interpretations of what theology is and what the study of theology is, and that there are discrepancies in those definitions. So for our purpose this afternoon, we're going to have a simple working definition of theology. Theology is the study of the nature and essence of God. Is that simple enough? Yeah. So that's what we're going to talk about. Some of us have been at this study, as I've said, longer than others, but nevertheless it's our common ground and common pursuit. We have to ask the question, why do we study theology? And I want to propose to you that one studies medicine so that they can practice medicine. One studies law so that they can practice law. One studies psychology so that they can practice psychology. And the reason we study theology is so that we can practice theology. Now, if you're with me at this point, you're probably asking, what does it mean to practice theology? I'm much more comfortable thinking about studying it than practicing it. The answer to the question, what does it mean to practice theology, is related to how one sees the primary purpose of understanding the nature and essence of God. I want to suggest three principal approaches to the study of theology that reflect three different purposes, not necessarily unrelated to each other, but nevertheless distinct. First, there's the personal approach to theological study. And the force or motivation behind such study is the pursuit of faith, personal faith. Here one studies the nature and essence of God in order to understand what it means to have a personal relationship with God. I want answers to the questions about my personal salvation, my redemption, my personal sin, the forgiveness of my personal sins, my sanctification, and ultimately where I will spend eternity. Practicing theology, when approaching the study of theology from the personal, is around the need to answer the questions, how do I live out my faith in a manner which glorifies God and which gives me meaning in life? While it is difficult to estimate the percentage of people who study the nature and essence of God primarily from a personal approach, we would do well to guess that it's fairly popular and fairly common. All you need to do is go to a religious bookstore and look at the titles of the books, and you will discover It's popular. It sells books. A second approach to theological study we could call the collective approach to understanding the nature and essence of God. This is when I want to know what the collective body of literature has to say about what the Christian faith believes, or perhaps what my particular Christian community or tradition believes is the nature and essence of God. So if you're a Methodist, you want to get that from a Methodist school. If you're Presbyterian, you want to get it from a Presbyterian school, Baptist, Lutheran, Mennonite, whatever it is. While the force or motivation behind approaching the study of theology from the personal is the pursuit of faith, the force behind the collective approach to theological study is the pursuit of truth. We study theology to answer two basic questions. What do I believe is the nature and essence of God? And what does my faith community believe is the nature and essence of God? And here I study theology in an attempt to formulate a belief system. A belief system that hopefully fits with my community, or that at least allows me to select a community of people with similar beliefs. I read multiple theologians and theological perspectives. I dialogue and debate with other theologians regarding truth, all in the pursuit of a belief system that not only enables me to speak truth about God with confidence, but also to study what it means to practice truth in a tradition of like believers. Such practice is frequently referred to as practical theology, when we learn to practice the truth we believe. Perhaps the book that best reflects this approach to understanding what it means to practice theology is the recent book entitled Practicing Theology, Beliefs and Practices in Christian Life, edited by Miroslav Volf and Dorothy Bass. In this book, 13 theologians from a variety of Christian traditions explore the relationship between Christian thinking and practice in the daily lives, ministries, and education of believers. Studying theology in the pursuit of truth in order to formulate a belief system is what dominates academic theology. All one need do is visit the library of a theological institution to see how prevalent the study of theology from the perspective of the search for truth and belief is. I want to talk about a third approach, however, to the study of theology, and that's when the primary objective of understanding the nature and essence of God is to seek an understanding of what "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth" means. And this is what we are calling public theology. If the force behind the study of theology from the personal is faith, and from the collective study of theology is truth, the force or motivation behind studying theology to understand God's will on earth is hope. Hope that there's a better way for life in this complex world in which we live. Hope that there's a better way for the diverse society to live together locally and globally. Hope for humankind. Hope that there's a better way for creation. Hope that there's a better way for life than the kingdoms of this world now provide. Here one studies the nature and essence of God in the world in order to put flesh and action on that hope for the world. We can hear that pursuit of hope in the poetic words in Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I have a dream. I have a dream that one day, and then he goes on the roll call of what will happen in one day, all with a vision for the future, a hope for the future. And then he concludes that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. Martin Luther King Jr. was in that speech practicing public theology. Public theology has an eschatological hope that one day things will be different, and that God's will on earth will be visible to all creation. Perhaps no other academic theologian captures this way of studying and practicing theology better than Jürgen Moltmann. In his book, The Theology of Hope, Moltmann laid the foundation upon which many public theologians from a variety of Christian traditions have built. He laid the foundation for the theological discipline we call public ministry and public theology. Moltmann writes, "We raise the question of the concrete theological form assumed by eschatological hope. What does hope mean for the social shape of Christianity in modern society? Moltmann, reflecting on the history of the church in the industrial age and the status of the church in contemporary society, concludes in the final chapter of his book. And listen to this. What became of the Christian church in its social significance as a result of the development of the industrial society? The result of this development was that the church lost the character of cultus publicus. It became something which, in its religious form, it never was, and which, moreover, from the theological standpoint of the scriptures, it can never seek to be, namely, a cultus privatus. Religion ceases to be public and becomes a voluntary private activity. Religion in the course of the 19th century becomes the religiosity of the individual, private, inward, self-edifying, and this process was furthered by many revivalist and pietist movements within Christianity. There prevailed within it a pious individualism, which for its own part was romanticist in form and withdrew itself from the entanglements of society. The church thus slipped over into the modern cultus privatist and produced in theology and pastoral care a corresponding self-consciousness as a haven of intimacy and guardian of personality for a human race that had developed into a materialist society. He laid it on the line, didn't he? Theologians from a variety of Christian traditions, evangelical, liberal, conservative, Catholic, liberationist, womanist, and black, and other descriptive theological labels, have taken up Moltmann's call to challenge the material, physical, political, economic, social, and spiritual realities of the world as it is. Many names easily come to mind, for me and maybe for you too. Max Stackhouse, David Tracy, Aubrey Hendricks, James Cone, Jim Wallace, Ron Snyder, Cornel West, Chad Myers, Jim Perkinson, Bill Wiley-Kellerman, William Stringfellow, Susan Thistlethwaite, Walter Wink, Jim Forbes, Martin Marty, and all the list could go on. All of them public theologians. Additionally, there's a Christian Association of Public Theologians now, a global network for public theology, and an international journal of public theology. So while some of you may be saying, I wish this would go away, it doesn't seem to be going in that direction. The practice of theology as a public theologian, seeking to know the nature and essence of God's will on earth, calls for a deliberative, disciplined process of theological analysis of a social context. In the book, How to Think Theologically, Howard Stone and James Duke, one a historical theologian, the other a practical theologian, contend that theology is a vital practical skill by which people can make religious sense of concrete life issues, situations, choices, and actions that fulfill their intellectual vocation as theologians. One of the things I say to students when I teach the public theology class, take off your hat as a student, you are a theologian in here. And for all the time you're in this class, you identify yourself as a theologian. They set the stage to do this by identifying two orders or forms of theology. The first order of theology they identify as embedded theology, and the second order of theology they identify as deliberative theology. The first order of theology is the implicit theology that is deeply embedded in one's faith tradition and one's mind, heart, and soul. It is one's belief system. And here we see how important and essential and critical is the pursuit of truth about the nature and essence of God we do in academia. It is what forms and informs our embedded theology. The second order of theology is the disciplined reflection upon how one's belief system informs decisions, choices, lifestyles, actions, and activities in the world. It is this second form of theology, deliberative theology, which informs how we understand the practice of public theology. The practice of public theology calls one to a disciplined reflection from the perspective of faith on the decisions, choices, policies, actions taken not by oneself, not even by one's faith community, but by the social, political, and economic systems, institutions, organizations that serve the common good of the public. Public theology does this reflection not to contemplate and understand the world, nor to condemn the world, but rather to transform the world so God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Public theology starts from a theological conviction that God is neither distant or passive in accomplishing God's will on earth, but rather that God is an active force on earth seeking to establish God's kingdom on earth. Public theology resists what is probably the most common metaphorical image of God as an old white man with a beard sitting on a throne. Much more helpful to the public theologian are the metaphors of wind, fire, and water describing God on earth. It is helpful to think of the disciplined practice of public theology in the world through the lens of three vocational roles of the public theologian: the role of priest, the role of prophet, and the role of king. And by king I mean leader, but king helps us understand that there's power involved. Two vocational roles of priest stand out. The priest served as the mediator between the divine and the human, and the priest pronounces God's blessing on human actions, activities, choices, and decisions when they are in line with God's will on earth. In the priestly role, the public theologian identifies the presence, activity, and agenda of God on earth, particularly where it is found in structures, systems, institutions, organizations that care for the common good of community. We might call this identifying streams of God's activity on earth. It requires intentional discipline observation and listening skills on the part of the theologian when entering the public sphere. The process is foundational for theological analysis of any public concern or public issue. When I was at Scoop, we had students from a variety of seminaries coming in for a semester of studies, and would start each semester with a 2-week, we called it Orientation to the City and Urban Ministry. And each day, after we were out visiting various ministries and agencies and so forth working in the city, we would have come back and have a time of experiential reflection. And during this process, either I or one of the Scoop staff would ask the question, where did you see God today? The first time we asked that question, it was almost always a stumper for students. They didn't know how to answer it, which was okay. We didn't ask the question to confound students. We asked the question because we wanted students to know, seminary students to know, they weren't bringing God to the city. God was already there. And their task as theologians was to identify God's presence in the city. By the time we ended 2 weeks of orientation, students could answer that question. And that's what we hope happens when we teach public theology, that students are in tune with understanding how they can identify God's presence in the public sphere. The practice of public theology in the role of priests looks for evidence of God's activity in the world. It calls on the theologian to see the essence and nature of God in an active form. It's helpful for the practice of public theology to use verbs when talking about God rather than nouns. When thinking about the nature and essence of God in the public sphere, verbs help. When, for instance, we consider God's righteousness, we do not think of it as a characteristic or attribute of God, but an action of God. The biblical concept of the righteousness of God is most helpful here. In the Old Testament scriptures, the righteousness of God is not an attribute of God whereby God must render to each what he has merited and is a quantity of merit which God gives, but is the act or activity of God whereby God puts or sets right that which is wrong. Very often in the Old Testament, the Hebrew nouns, which are translated righteousness in the English translation, are derived from the Hebrew verbs. The verb has the primary meaning to be in the right. The causative form of the verb, generally translated to justify, means to put in the right or to set right. Thus, it very often has the meaning to vindicate or to give redress to those who have suffered wrong. When applied to God, the righteousness of God is God acting to put right the wrong. Very often in the Old Testament, it is the action of God for the vindication and deliverance of God's people. It is the activity in which God saves people by rescuing them from their oppressors. The poet's way of describing God's righteousness is making the crooked places straight. The story about Martin Luther is a good one. And it was that he was having struggle thinking about himself being a priest, because he did not see himself as a righteous person, i.e., holy person, a good person. Martin Luther, we understand, loved his beer. And he loved the lifestyle that went with beer drinking. And so he didn't know whether he could fit as a priest. And it wasn't until his studies in the monastery led him to understand righteousness from the Old Testament. And understand that righteousness basically was making the crooked straight. He said, I could do that. So the writing of the 95 Theses that we attribute to Martin Luther was not the act of a rebellious priest. It was an act of a righteous priest, doing righteousness and trying to set the crooked straight. The public theologian is a researcher looking for streams of God's righteousness in the public sphere, where those who care for the common good are making the crooked straight. In the priestly role, the public theologian names righteousness, lifts it up for all to see, and publicly blesses it. In a similar way, the public theologian looks for the active nature and essence of God's love in the world. Is this not what John did in the gospel? For God so loved the world that he gave. When we look for God's love in the world, we are not looking for sentimentality. We are, like the writer of the gospel, looking for action, the action of sacrificial giving. It would be interesting to substitute the word world with the word public. For God so loved the public that he gave. The public theologian identifies God's love in action in the public arena. Now, it's worthy of note that John uses the word world more often than any other writer in the New Testament. And just about every time he uses the word world, it's used to describe a dominant force that was at enmity with God. Perhaps another good translation is, for God so loved his enemies that he gave. The public theologian also looks for the nature and essence of God's hope in the world. The ability to see hope is based on one's capacity, and this is important, to see a reality beyond that which is immediately visible. If you focus only on the immediate reality, it's pretty hard to have hope. It's what we call vision, but it's not just any vision, but vision for the kingdom of God on earth. Public theologians are not merely dreamers. They see something beyond the problems and issues which occupy so much of our energy in this world. They are driven not by the problems of society, but by possibilities beyond our imagination. Public theologians are disruptive innovators. Some of you may have read some of the stuff coming out of Harvard about disruptive innovation. It's embedded in public theology. Public theology looks for the nature and essence of God's grace in the world, and it's all around us. We see the Spirit of grace in the gift of life itself. We see the Spirit of grace when we experience beauty. The Spirit of God's grace is seen in the gift of mercy, forgiveness, and kindness, not deserved or merited, but lived out for the common good. We look for the action of grace. Public theology understands and sees God's truth in the world, not as a fact, but as a way of life. In the public sphere, perhaps a helpful word that describes such truth might be integrity. Integrity is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles. Moral uprightness. In ethics, integrity is regarded by many people as the honesty and truthfulness or accuracy of one's actions. Integrity stands in opposition to hypocrisy. The word integrity evolved from the Latin adjective integer, meaning whole or complete. So we might say integrity is the inner sense of wholeness, deriving from qualities such as honesty and consistency of character. As such, one may experience or see integrity to the extent the actions of an organization or system match the values, beliefs, and principles they claim to hold. When teaching the course in public theology, one of the reflective questions we ask after a visit with an organization or public agency caring for the public agenda is, did you trust them? Whenever a system or organizational program operates with the spirit of integrity, sometimes there's just an intuitive trust that we have. But we also trust social agencies, organizations, institutions serving the public because they are faithful to the mission they claim to have, and because by their fruits they are known. Practicing public theology means being alert to the dynamic power of the spirit of joy in the public sphere, not the kind of joy pursued through seeking pleasure, but the kind of joy that fills one's soul and one's entire being and informs the purpose of serving the common good. It is the unreasonable joy that comes when we know that God's in control of this world. The kind of joy that comes from anticipation of good news. The kind of joy that makes one want to sing. It is the joy of the psalmist. Listen to Psalm 98. Sing to the Lord a new song. For he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him. The Lord has made his salvation known and revealed his righteousness to the nations. He has remembered his love and his faithfulness to Israel. All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Burst into jubilant song with music. Make music to the Lord with the harp and the sound of singing, with trumpets and the blasts of the ram's horn. Shout for joy before the Lord the King. Isaac Watts got hooked by this psalm. And the hymn we sing as a Christmas carol, Joy to the World, he wrote as a result of encountering this psalm. He never intended that to be a Christmas carol. He intended it to be a hymn of public theology. Deeply embedded in the core of public theology is an appreciation of the importance of God's kingdom and God's justice on earth. Public theology is ever alert to streams of God's justice in society. The words of God spoken through Amos addressing the nation of Israel reverberates within the soul of the public theologian. I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them, and I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sounds of your harps, but let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream, which is where we get the idea of looking for streams of God's activity on earth. Here we come face to face with both the anger and power of God. Who is God angry with? The nation of Israel. When we look at the multiple references to God's demand for justice throughout the Bible, by far, both Old and New Testament, by far, most references refer to either nations, cities, or governments, and relate to the way systems of power and people in power are treating the defenseless ones under their rule. It is when we look for the justice of God on earth, we come face to face with the evil embedded in the spirit of dominance and the spirit of empire. Nicholas Wolterstorff wrote this about the transformation of his own theological worldview relative to justice in society. It's a good quote. These experiences, that is, encounters with suffering in the context of injustice in our world, have evoked in me a great deal of reflection and reorientation. Justice has become for me one of the fundamental categories through which I view the world. I think of justice not so much as a virtue, but as a condition of society. A society is just insofar as people enjoy what is due them, enjoy what they have a legitimate claim to. Slowly I began to see that the Bible is a book about justice. But what a strange and haunting form of justice. Not our familiar modern Western justice of no one invading one's right to determine one's life as one will, but rather the justice of the widow, the orphan, and the alien. A society is just when all the little ones, all the defenseless ones, all the unprotected ones have been brought back into community to enjoy a fair share in the community's goods and a standing and voice in the affairs of the community. Biblical justice is the shepherd leaving the corral to look for the 101 and then throwing a feast when the one is found. Ultimately, public theology is the pursuit of peace on earth. Again, public theology does not think of peace as merely a virtue, but an active force that flows freely in our world. The ultimate war is between the values and spirits of dominance in this world and the spirit of empire versus the spirit of God's kingdom on earth. That war is being waged at every level of our society. The spirit of this world can rule in organizations, institutions, systems, agencies, business, families, churches, synagogues, mosques. Peace is found where there is reconciliation between the sins of this world as it is and the rule of God on earth. This is the work of the public theologian as a peacemaker. And this is what the practice of public theology looks like when the public theologian, in the role of priest, finds evidence of God's activity in the public sphere. The theologian names the observable evidence of God's activity, lifts it up, and blesses it. In a course that I do in public theology at Louisville Seminary this last time, I partnered with a church in downtown Louisville. It was an African-American church. The pastor and the congregation, I met with them before we did the course, and they were concerned about the Cradle to prison pipeline that existed for individuals, black individuals, particularly male individuals in their church and in their community. And they asked if the class could focus on what was that all about? How did that happen? And so the first weekend we spent in class, the pastor set up visits to agencies, organizations working with black youth in Louisville, Kentucky. And one of the things that we did before we went out, we talked about, well, we're going to go and listen to these folks, but we're also going to go as theologians and we're going to practice theology. So after every presentation, I want us to go to reflect back to the presenter, where did you see God? So they did it. So after we were doing this for 2 days, we came back to the church and we did a time of reflection about the experience of the 2 days. And one of the students said, I had never experienced anything like this in my life. She went on to say, I noticed that when we did the work of public theology as priest, every one of the presenters, regardless of whether they were people of faith or not, were emotionally moved. Most of them with tears in their eyes. Because we named where we saw God and what they were doing in the city of Louisville, we lifted it up and we went through a ritual of blessing with them. I want to say that the work of the public theologian as priest is essential in being an agent of developing life in the community. This young woman said to me, I have learned in these 2 days that public theology is a spiritual process as well as a mental process. But we want to talk about, for a minute here or two, about the prophetic role in the practice of public theology. And that calls for a different set of skills and actions. They are described in Romans, the 2nd chapter. Do not be conformed to this present world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind so that you may test and approve what is the will of God, what is good and well-pleasing and righteous. 3 vocational dimensions of the prophetic role stand out. The public theologian as prophet is called to stand outside the mainstream of society. The public theologian as prophet has a different mindset and a different voice than the powers of this world. And the public theologian as prophet is focused on establishing God's will on earth. While public theology and the vocational role of priest names God's values on earth and blesses them, the public theologian in the vocational role of prophet wrestles with the tensions that exist between the way of the world and the way of God on earth. Walter Wink, many of you know, an ordained Methodist minister, in his book Engaging the Powers, calls it discernment and resistance in a world of domination. He contrasts the domination system that sanctifies violence as a way of life with God's domination-free order. Anyone who's going to do public theology must read Engaging the Powers. The practice of the public theologian as prophet begins by identifying where the obstacles and resistance are to the free-flowing of God's activity and agenda on earth. Most often those obstacles are observable and found in authority, social, political, and economic systems of authority that have the power to determine the direction and well-being of the common good. So, we have, instead of the free-flowing of God's righteousness, there is the spirit of dominance. Instead of God's love, there's greed. Instead of God's hope, there's despair. Instead of God's grace, there is vengeance and vindictiveness. Instead of God's truth, there is deceit. Instead of faithfulness, there is betrayal. Instead of joy, there is suffering and pain. Instead of God's justice, there is the abuse of power. And instead of God's peace, there is violence and war. Sometimes those obstacles can easily be corrected when the powers that be recognize that the system is not serving the common good. Sometimes, however, those values which reflect the spirit of empire are embedded so deeply in the structure and systems of this world that more is required than reason. When the social, political, economic systems are embedded with the values of the spirit of empire or the spirit of evil, the role of the prophet is to speak truth to power. It's a fight. We hear Paul's words ringing in our ears, don't we? Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Last week we commemorated the 50th anniversary of Bloody Sunday in Selma. We saw the prophetic role of the public theologian vividly portrayed in the movie Selma, where Martin Luther King Jr. practiced public theology as a prophet and spoke truth to power, even when the powers thought they were in control of the agenda. The spirit of empire as evil is certainly seen in the empires that dominate our world. I sometimes fear that Hollywood is way ahead of the church in being able to recognize the dangers of the spirit of empire. Hunger Games, if you've seen it, is a demonstration of how Hollywood is sensitive to empire and the danger of empire thinking. I want to suggest, however, that the spirit of dominance can not only possess nations and empires, but also possess organizations, institutions, agencies, corporations, businesses, and families. The Lord's Prayer reminds us the dangers all around us and encourages us to pray, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Temptations to live out the values of empire, the values of this world, rather than the values of the kingdom of God, are seductive and powerful. We are seduced and trapped when we think that the world and the powers of this world should like us as people of God. Dennis Jacobson, a Lutheran pastor and public theologian in Milwaukee, writes in his book, Doing Justice, "The world as it is the enemy of God. The world as it is the enemy of the people of God. A great tension exists between the world as it is and believers who are in the world but not of the world. It is so because the world as it is driven by abusive power, consuming greed, relentless violence, and narcissistic pride. The world as it is employs nationalism, propaganda, racism, civil religion, class enmity to bolster entrenched systems, corporations, and institutions, all of which are offensive to God." There's a wonderful study series put out by the Methodist Church entitled "The System Belongs to God." While the videos in this series are somewhat outdated, it is still a very powerful dialogue between Walter Wink, James Forms, and United Methodist minister Janet Wolfe. It is a series with a study guide that I'd encourage every church to use if the church decides to take seriously its role in the public realm. There's a third set of skills for the public theologian, and they are the skills of leadership. Again, we see this quality of the practice of public theology in the movie Selma. Martin Luther King was not only a prophet, he was, despite all the forces and opposition against him, a leader. It seems as if everyone's talking about leadership and leadership formation these days. There are multiple books and organizations suggesting if we follow a particular set of rules or principles, we will be an effective leader. I remember going to a one-week institute on leadership, where one of the prolific writers of some of this material said, and this is what I never forgot from that one-week institute, is that there's only one definite thing we can say about leadership. Leadership is always about change. And regardless of what position or title we have, if we are not doing change, we are not leading. It's something we might call management, and management is necessary. Management is good. But we do ourselves a disservice if we think management is leadership. Leadership is always about change. So a working definition of leadership for the practice of public theology might look like this. Leadership is when the theologian assumes responsibility for transforming, changing a social, political, or economic reality that serves the kingdoms of this world to a reality that serves the glory of God. That's a good definition of public theology. How does public theology do this? By organizing. Dr. Helen Slethered-Jameer, professor of urban studies at Claremont School of Theology, calls it prophetic activism. In a book by the same title, she describes the role of the faith community in contemporary America organizing for justice. Congregational-based organizing got started right here in Chicago by Saul Alinsky in the Back of the Yards neighborhood in the 1930s. Years before, Upton Sinclair had written a book called The Jungle, describing the awfulness of that neighborhood. The generally held assumption and response was that there was something wrong with the people who lived there in this impoverished neighborhood of immigrants, and that solution should be through a range of social services. It was and continues to be the classic response of blaming the victim. Alinsky, a radical thinker from the University of Chicago, saw it differently. He concluded that the problem was not with the people in the community, but with the outsiders who profited and abused the community for their own political and economic gain. Following Alinsky's basic principles, the faith community has confronted the principalities and powers all over the world with the evils of the abuse and misuse of power. And that's what organizing is all about, power. Public theologians as leaders understand that power is neutral, and it can be used in the service of justice or abused in the service of evil. The Spanish word for power is poder, which literally means the ability to act. Practicing public theology in the role of leader means embracing power as a means to get things done. Power is needed to combat the evil of racism. Power is needed to combat discrimination, to rebuild cities, to fight urban sprawl, to reduce drug trafficking, to improve school systems, and on and on and on. We cannot do that unless we embrace power. Last fall, here at Garrett Seminary, Caroline and I sat in one of Angela Kauser's classes and heard one of the best class sessions we have ever heard on community organizing. In my opinion, every seminary in the country wanting to take seriously clergy leadership formation should be teaching the art and skills of faith-based community organizing. Look where it got Barack Obama. We started this lecture by suggesting that we're all students of theology. Some of us searching for faith, some of us searching for truth, some of us searching for justice in the world. I always say to students taking my course in public theology that one of the class objectives is to enable every student to see themselves as capable of practicing public theology. And so I conclude with a story from St. Paul, Minnesota, where I was teaching a course in public theology at a Lutheran church in the Dale Selby area of St. Paul. Anybody knows St. Paul knows that the Dale Selby area of St. Paul is probably the poorest economic community in St. Paul. It's a mixed community with a high number of African Americans. When I met with the pastor, he said, I want you to meet with a committee in the church. I've got a committee that cares about this community and cares about justice in this community. Will you meet with them? I said, sure. 5 people on the committee. All 5 of them took the course because they wanted to have an understanding how to address the injustices of their community. And so we did this course, and we did one-on-one visits in the community. We visited community organizations, community agencies, and so forth, to try to understand what the issues were of injustice were in the community. And one popped up over and over again. It was the foreclosure process that banks were using in this community and this community only. And what it was is the bank would say, with no heads up, you're out. You're out. You didn't pay your mortgage, you're out. And they could do nothing about it. And so the community was literally falling apart. Of course, the bank then got the property, and who knows what was going to happen next? Well, we can guess. So the church and the students decided we're going to take that one on as a justice issue. And in one semester, these students organized people in that community to come out so that we packed the church with a public meeting. And in that public meeting were bank presidents, representatives of the city council, state representatives who heard people tell their testimony and story about what it was to be tossed out of their home because they missed one payment on their mortgage. Now, the good thing about it is, one of those persons that heard those stories had power and took the issue to the state government of Minnesota, where a law was passed. The banks no longer could do this in any community, including the Dale Selby community of St. Paul. But I add to that story. In that class was a young woman who was a senior, and she was candidating for a church. And at the end of the class, she was going out to candidate. She emailed me and said, you know what they asked me when I sat down? They asked me, okay, if we were to call you to this church to be our pastor, what would you do the first year you were here? Not a bad question. She said, listen, if you call me as pastor, you're calling a theologian. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. When I come as a pastor to any church, what I'm going to be looking for is, I'm looking for God's righteousness in the church and in the community. And I'm looking for God's love in the church and in the community. And I'm looking for God's hope in the church and in the community. I'm looking for God's grace. I'm looking for God's truth. I'm looking for God's faithfulness. I'm looking for God's joy. I'm looking for God's justice. I'm looking for God's peace. And every week I'm going to be visiting in this community and in this church. And on Sunday morning, I'm going to tell you stories about where I found God in this church and in this community. She got the call. It was a unanimous call. First time that church had ever given a unanimous call to a student from seminary. Several months later, a year later, she sent me an email and she said, you know those streams of God's activity you taught us? They've turned into rivers. You would think our Lutheran church was a Baptist church, because now on Sunday morning, we put into the worship service, to God be the glory. And anybody who wants to tell a story about where they saw God in the life that they lived that week can get up and say, this is where I saw God. And we have a testimonial service for 10 minutes every Sunday morning to the glory of God. That's what public theology is. It's an active practicing of identifying where God is, where the forces are that oppose God's will, and then taking action in such a way that we can transform the social order. Thank you.